Hello, YouTube, and welcome to Civics, Episode 6. And today we're going to be talking about our executive branch, which was written out in Article 2 of the Constitution. So we'll be talking about what the executive branch is, what it does, and all the kind of the bits and pieces of it. So to get started, Article 2 establishes our executive leadership for our country. When we were the colonies, we were under the executive leadership of the King of England. And under the Articles of Confederation, there wasn't really an executive power. There wasn't one person who could make a decision. There had to be deliberation, and you had to go through the Congress, and it was messy. And so going on after that, the people of the United States decided that it was really important that there was a leader who the country could turn to, who could make those decisions with one single authority. And so the executive leadership in our country is the president, and he oversees all of the government bureaucracy. So all of the departments and offices and all of that he and his administration oversees is the executive branch of government. The president is not directly elected, although everybody gets to vote. Remember, the Electoral College is who decides who the president is, not the general election. So that election does help decide who becomes president, but it all ends up becoming the electors in the Electoral College. So we have an indirect election to determine who our president is. And the Electoral College was created by the founders because they didn't trust ordinary people to make the right decision. They didn't believe that people were smart enough, invested enough, knowledgeable enough to make that kind of decision. And so the original intent of the Electoral College was to make it so that if the people voted for someone who was not right or wasn't good, for whatever reason, the electors who went and actually decided who the president was could vote for somebody else. Nowadays, it doesn't work that way. Whoever is chosen through the electors actually have to vote for that person. They don't have the free will that they did earlier in our country's history. To become president, there's a few requirements that you have to meet. For one, you have to be a natural-born citizen. So that means you have to have been born in the United States or in its territories, and you have to be 35. So they wanted you to be old enough to make these important decisions, have enough life experience to be a worthy leader. And you had to have lived in the United States for the past 14 years. There are exceptions to that rule. So, for instance, if you are serving the United States military and you are off fighting a war, or you're at a military base on foreign soil, that's considered living in the United States, and you're still allowed to run for president. Now, back when the Constitution was written, but now you can't be a president if you've been part of a rebellion against the nation, and that's part of the 14th Amendment. So if you are a member of the Confederacy, you can't become president anymore. And then if you've held office 2 times or up to 10 years, right, you cannot no longer run for president. And that was the 22nd Amendment. So after FDR was president, we put a limit on how many times you can become president. And that was a precedent that was set by George Washington. So George Washington was president for 2 full 4-year terms, and then he stepped down and gave his power up to somebody else. And that was a precedent that was established by him. So that 22nd Amendment really just kind of codified that precedent into law. So now you can't be president more than 2 terms. It also says that there's a chain of command, kind of. So if the president leaves office or dies, the vice president takes over as the president, so he becomes the next president. And then there's a chain of people afterwards. So there's always a line of succession in case there's a mass death of government officials or whatever. So what powers does the president have? Well, the president has the full and complete control of the military because he's the commander-in-chief. So that means military decisions at the end, it does end up going through him. So he is the one who makes the big decisions. little tiny details and stuff like that is what his generals are for, but he is the one who does set the tone and make the large decisions about what the military is doing. He is allowed to establish a body or a group of people to advise and consent with him, and that's become the cabinet. So the cabinet is a group of people who run the departments of the federal government, and they are supposed to advise him on all the different matters that he has to attend to, so that he's not trying to make these decisions and do all this research on his own. There are people in his administration who are knowledgeable experts in that area who can inform him on what might be the best course of action. He still gets to make the decision, but he's getting help. So it's not just him doing it all by himself. He's got people who are doing the research, doing the footwork, so that he can make the best informed decision possible. Presidents are allowed to negotiate treaties. So any kind of treaty or large agreement between nations, the president gets to negotiate those things, or he can appoint people to negotiate them. However, 2/3 of the Senate have to agree. So he can't just willy-nilly make treaties. He has to make that treaty, and then the Senate has to agree to the treaty. So if he makes a bad treaty and the Senate decides that it's not good, then that treaty doesn't work. He does get to make appointments. So there are lots of different federal agencies where he gets to appoint the leaders or the different things. He gets to appoint Supreme Court justices. He gets to appoint judges and all sorts of different things. And 50% of the Senate needs to agree with those. So he is checked in that way. He can't just appoint whoever he wants. The Senate has to agree that the person he's picked is a good fit for the position. Now, in the Article 2, it does say that he has to give some sort of address to Congress, talking about the State of the Union. Now, the first State of the Union was not a speech. It was just a letter that George Washington wrote to Congress, and they read it aloud. And for a long time, there was no speech for it. But as time moved on, it has kind of become a yearly thing that the president does, where he goes to Congress, everybody sits down, and he gives a speech about what he thinks is happening in our nation, and then also what he thinks we should do moving forward. And that's kind of become a big event every year. And then he can also recommend things to Congress. So, for instance, if he thinks like there's something really important that needs to happen, he can recommend a plan, or he can make recommendations so that Congress can take those things up. So he can do that. He can convene Congress if necessary. So if he thinks it's an extremely important thing is happening and he needs Congress to do something, he can make them come and convene and do their job. If they're on vacation or on break, he's allowed to do that. He receives all foreign representatives. So if someone from another country comes who is coming to the United States to talk about this, that, or the other thing, he receives them. And those are what state dinners are all about. So whenever ambassadors or other foreign dignitaries come over, he'll receive them, and they'll have a fancy dinner at the White House, and they'll do that kind of thing. That's his job. And then he also must execute the law, right? It's the executive branch. So he has to actually make sure that the laws that Congress passes are being enforced, and he has the power to decide how that'll happen. So, for instance, like Congress might pass a law that says, from now on, lawn darts are illegal. Well, the president is the one who gets to decide how to enforce that law, right? He's like, okay, are we gonna have the FBI tracking who has lawn darts? Are we gonna let local police handle those kind of things? Are we gonna let the state police handle that? How are we gonna execute that law? So the president is the one who decides the way that's all that's gonna happen. So Congress is allowed to give the executive branch the money to do things, but then he decides, for the most part, obviously Congress will say, like, we need to use this for this and this for this, but he gets to decide how or who gets that money and how it's going to work out. As time has passed in our country, the president has gained a lot more power that he and or she, we haven't had a she president yet, but maybe soon, has gained more power than they originally had. And that's basically just because the world has changed. In 1790s, right, there wasn't the internet, there weren't machine guns, There weren't all these different technological advances that have happened. And so now the president has to be able to do things faster than they did back in 1790, right? Back in 1790, Congress had to approve a war. Well, now war doesn't happen, over the course of months. It happens, minute by minute, second by second. And the president has to be able to respond much quicker than they would have had to in 1790. So the president has a little bit more leniency and more authority to do things. And that's just because of the passage of time. So the president and the executive branch is more powerful than it used to be. And each president has had more or less power based on what they needed to do and what's going on in the world at the time. For example, Abraham Lincoln had a lot more power, arguably, than most presidents did, because his entire presidency they were at during the Civil War. So he had much more far-sweeping powers than most presidents do. Meanwhile, there are other presidents who had a lot less power. So that kind of fluctuates as time. But the general trend is that presidents have gained more power over time. The other thing is that the federal government now plays such a large role in our day-to-day lives and how our government works, and that's because we have a large bureaucracy that has to implement all of these different laws and restrictions and all these sorts of things that we've passed and we think are important, right? We need to have people who can run the State Department. We need to have people who work in law enforcement. So we have like the DPA and the FBI and all of that. All those people are government employees. We have a lot of bank regulations now. All those people, to regulate the banks, we have to have people that are skilled at accounting and skilled at how money works and how banks operate. And those are all federal employees, and all sorts of different things. All of the military is federal employees. That's all under this big group of the federal government and the federal bureaucracy. So that large group has become much more formidable and large, and so that has changed over time as well. It used to be much smaller, and now it's a lot larger. So that's kind of the basic rundown of the executive branch in Article 2. In the next episode, we'll talk about the judiciary branch and what's going on there. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next episode.